Never go nuclear. The EU goes after Hungary. If there's one thing people with power always do when confronted with intransigence, it is that they always go nuclear. As a parent, we've all been there. There's that moment when your child calls your bluff on a particular thing you've been arguing over, and you're left with no other option than to go through with some terrible threat or back down. Backing down is usually the right call, but the right course of action was to never get into that situation in the first place. Because when you do go nuclear, the damage from that is invariably far worse than whatever it was you were fighting about in the first place. Because the nuclear option creates scars. It builds layers of distrust which cannot be smoothed over with an apology later. Well, now the EU has invoked their version of the nuclear option against Hungary for refusing to accept migrants as part of the Soros/Merkel plan to import chaos and unrest into all corners of the European Union. Hungarian President Viktor Orbán has steadfastly refused to budge 1 inch on this issue. He has politically gone after George Soros directly by passing a strong anti-NGO law that takes its structure from a similar one passed in Russia, championed by President Vladimir Putin. Orbán's refusal to accept one migrant is where the rubber of national sovereignty meets the road of globalism. Orbán knows exactly what he is doing, and he knows the consequences of this course of action. The EU's response is a system of a much deeper problem that persists due to its fundamentally anti-democratic structure, with the veneer of democracy here calling for a vote to ratify a biased report on Hungary's human rights abuses. 487 MEPs voted to pursue stripping Hungary of its voting rights within the EU, which is what the ultimate result of an Article 7 invocation would entail. But the catalyst for this series of events lies with the unilateral decision of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who let in millions of migrants without the consent of other EU members, knowing she had the backing of a majority in the EU Parliament should anyone balk. In other words, this nuclear option was always in the cards. From the moment men like Orbán stood up and said no to this, the specter of Article 7 was floated in the press. So make no mistake, this was always the plan. The problem for the technocrats in the EU, as they are finding out with Brexit negotiations and the Catalonian independence movement, is that people want their countries back. They never signed up for this insane bureaucracy and legalese weaseling, nor did they sign up for the hollowing out of their core economies through wealth transfer payments via the euro. Men like Matteo Salvini of Italy and Viktor Orbán understand that Germany uses the mispriced euro, which itself cannot be properly priced, to roll wealth up to it and then complain about internal EU wealth transfer payments as a way to shame countries like Poland and Hungary into accepting any edict from it. This is why Salvini is calling for a League of Leagues, along with Orbán, to wrest control of the European Parliament from the global financiers and oligarchs through whom politicians like Merkel speak. And when they still say no, then Merkel, Juncker, and the rest of the vile European media play up on this idea that these countries want to, quote, have their cake and eat it too. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this from Europeans who oppose Orbán's stance on immigration. But that is exactly the intended effect, dividing people over money expropriated at gunpoint and then used as political weapons. That argument neatly sidesteps the reality that both systems are wrong. The wealth transfer payments are wrong, and so are the unilateral actions of a German chancellor with sub-30% approval rating at home, making policy for an entire continent. The whole thing is Kafkaesque in its absurdity. And that was exactly the point. But at the same time, it's also why this whole Article 7 nuclear option will become a nightmare for Merkel, Juncker, and the rest of the sniveling, virtue-signaling backstabbers on Soros' payroll in the European Parliament, all 226 of them. Because Orbán and Salvini are the future of Europe, not French poodle Emmanuel Macron or Angela Merkel, whose power animal is the cockroach. They know who their enemies are. They are naming names and playing for keeps. And both men know that they will have to continue saying no to everything put in front of them that would compromise their national sovereignty. In fact, going nuclear will give Orbán, Salvini, and Polish President Andrzej Duda all the ammunition they need to go back to their people, cry victim, and inflame Italian, Hungarian, and Polish national sentiment even further. It will make Salvini and his partner in populism, M5S's leader Luigi Di Maio's job even easier to hold the line on EU's budget and tax reforms. Meanwhile, in Germany, people call Merkel a traitor at public appearances, and Alternative for Germany rises in the polls while Merkel's support sinks. Beginning the Article 7 process against Hungary is a check that the feckless leftist MEPs can't cash. Orban and Al will come out of this stronger because you can't publicly shame men who stand for something a majority of the people across the Western world values, namely their sense of place. It will give them the ammunition they need at home and the opportunity to lead by example and reveal all of these threats as nothing more than bluffs. Because what's next? Kicking Hungary out of the EU? Poland? Italy? That plays directly into their hands. Why do you think Orban never entered Hungary into the Eurozone? Why do you think Salvini wants out of it? This rebuke is like a parent saying, "Not while you live under my roof." And the child walks out the door on their 18th birthday and rarely ever calls.